Okay, so we're going to talk about the nervous system today. So we're going to start by talking about the functions. So a lot of us have said for our little intro activity, something with signals, and that's absolutely correct. So our nervous system does three main things. Number one is it gathers information. Your nerves send information from all over your body, both inside and out. So some information that we can get from outside the body, all of our senses, right? So our sense of sight, sound, touch, um, taste, all of those are information that comes from outside our body and is sent to our brain. But we also have things that we monitor change inside our body. So, for example, your stomach has stretch receptors, and their job is to sense when your stomach is getting full. So, when your stomach gets full, it stretches so that your sends signals to your brain to let you know that you can stop eating. Um, Process information that's your brain. So when we get that information, when you see that like predator, I'm going to talk a lot about like kind of caveman stuff, right? Um, so when you see that giant like saber-toothed tiger flying at you, right? That sensory input, the smell, the sights, the sounds, go to your brain, and then that information is processed to let you know what to do. If you're driving in a car, right, you see the car in front of you slam on the brakes, you need to process the information that, holy crap, the guy in front of me, I see the red lights, they're getting closer, and you need to translate that to an action pretty quickly. And that's what we go to with motor output. So we need to respond to these stimulus. So it could be running away from something that's chasing you. It could be slamming on the brakes. All these need some kind of action. So that's kind of our three main functions: gather information, do something with it, and then create some reaction. Okay, so for our nerve system, we have two types of cells. We have the neurons. On the star neuron, we're going to go into this more detail. They carry and store information. So they carry information in the terms of nerves, and they store information in our brain. And then we have glial cells. So these are all the different cells that kind of help your brain work. We're going to use a lot of analogies for this. One way to look at it is the neurons are kind of like the roads where information travels. The glial cells are kind of like the maintenance crews. They make sure that the roads stay connected to each other, that they're not backing up with waste and other things. So they help the roads information go smoothly. So they provide support and insulation. And we're going to see today the Schwann cells are really important. These like flat pancake looking cells are really important because they wrap around the neurons and help them transmit information. And that gives us to our neuron. So our neuron is a weird looking cell. It has a couple different regions to it, and it helps it perform its function. So one of our biggest features this year, right, structure and function. So we're going to look at this in more detail about the shape of these and how it helps them do their job. All right, so let's look at our neuron. First, we have our dendrites. So the dendrites are these little tentacle looking things coming out the end. This is where our process starts. So they receive signals in the form of chemicals. These are what we call neurotransmitters. So you get chemicals in the form of, like, say, serotonin. Serotonin's your happy hormone, right? It makes you feel good. Oxytocin's the bonding hormone. So you can get these from like different natural processes. So like mothers, when they're breastfeeding, their body releases oxytocin, which is sometimes called like the love hormone, and that reacts with nerves and tries to get these to fire and like create bonding between mom and baby. If you take like antidepressants or stimulants or depressants, right? So caffeine, alcohol, antidepressants, all of them act on your cells by getting them to send signals. So these can be picking up things from your body or from other neurons. So the information comes in from the dendrites. It goes to the cell body here. And this is kind of like what keeps the cell alive. It's got all of the different parts of it, which keep the cell alive. So it's got the mitochondria, which gives the cell energy, the nucleus, which has the DNA, and all the other different parts that keep the cell running. So if you lack any of them, so if you lack, for example, if your dendrites, if you lack some of the neurotransmitters or different things that start reactions, you can have different diseases. Like, so for example, if you lack receptors for like melatonin, you can't fall asleep. So some people that may take like melatonin supplements, it helps them fall asleep. If like one of the problems too is if you become like dependent on drugs, so like any drugs, prescription drugs, like street drugs, all that stuff, it works by acting on your brain. So one of the ideas is building up a tolerance, right? The first time you take any substance, whether it be something illegal like caffeine, right? Imagine like giving a little kid caffeine for the first time, they're bouncing off the walls. But if you're drinking tons of coffee like I do all day, every day, you start building up a resistance to it. So if you lack these, you don't really have that response anymore. For our axons, we can think of the axons as kind of the wires of the nerves. Nerves connect, they send signals, right? And axons are kind of that highway that sends the signal here. So we pick up the signals at the dendrites, it moves through the cell body, down through the axons, and then it gets to this end, which is the axon terminal or synapse. And this is where it sends signals to other neurons. So signals are picked up, transmitted down, and released down here. And these can actually connect to another nerve, which picks up the signals, transmits it, releases, which goes to another nerve. So they're kind of chained together. So we have tons of nerves that act, or neurons that connect and act together in a big like network. And that's really how we think and how we act. A lot of it is, there's a saying, when it fires together, it wires together. So making connections between neurons is how we get behaviors, habits, personalities, memories. And we'll look more about that when we talk about the brain. This is a bigger picture of what we're looking at. Some of these different pieces will go in more detail. Others, we're just going to kind of look at the big picture. Okay. And this was one of the terms that we would see, that we're going to see for our lecture questions, is this myelin sheath. Myelin sheath. So a sheath is something that wraps around another object. So like, for example, like a sword, you sheathe a sword by putting the sheath in the like holder, right? So a sheath is something that wraps around it. One of the examples for this is if you think about wires, right? If you look at any power cord, it's not like it's just this naked piece of metal that's going from your wall to whatever your appliance is, right? If you think of power cords, they're typically wrapped around with rubber or plastic or some other thing that keeps the electricity going down the line. That's what the Schwann cells kind of do. They help speed up these electrical impulses, and they insulate, meaning they wrap around, they keep all of the currents going through the axon wires. So there were a lot of questions about the speed, right? So how fast do signals travel? One way to do this is test your reaction speed, right? If you take like a pencil and you drop it, how fast, and this is something that we'll look at a little bit later too, how fast can you catch it, right? So your brain has to process that it's falling. So it sees it, sends it to your brain, then your brain sends that signal to your hands to catch something. your reaction time is like that electrical speed. So if we didn't have these kind of flat pancake looking cells, and these cells are kind of weird because they wrap around, right? If we lack this, then it would take forever for signals to be sent to our brain. So going back to that driving down the road, right? Driving down the road, you see brake lights in front of you. You need to stop right then and there. You can't take a couple seconds for the signal to your eyes to go to your brain and then your brain to go to your foot, because you're already going to be plowed into the back seat of someone in front of you. So when we talk about our nervous system, so right now, yeah, exactly. So right now your brain is doing exactly what I'm saying, right? Your information's coming through, and this is where it's getting really weird, right? Because we have this distance for, so my voice, my brain is sending signals to my mouth to make me speak, which is going to a computer microphone, which picks up those signals, sends them to the computer through the internet to your Wi-Fi, to your computer, to your speakers that goes to your brain. And so there's like all these different levels of how information is being traveled right now, which is pretty insane. So when we look at our nervous system, yeah, I know. It's pretty crazy to think about all these things that are happening without us really knowing. And our brain is probably the coolest. And we're going to spend like 3 weeks doing stuff with the nervous system because it is like the most interesting of all of them for sure. So when we talk about our nervous system, there's kind of two different branches that we're going to look at. The central nervous system, which we're going to spend quite a bit of time on a little bit later. Once we understand kind of how signals are collected, that's where they go. So like your brain and your spinal cord are what collects information from the rest of your body and what sends information to the rest of your body. So we're going to focus a lot on just these nerves. So it's everything that's not the brain and the spinal cord. But the brain itself is really awesome. So we're going to look a little bit more about the different regions of the brain and what they do and what happens if you get brain damage. There's a really cool case about a guy called Phineas Gage who had a railroad spike shot through his skull, and he survived it, and his whole life changed. So we're going to spend a day looking at what happens when you get like brain damage in certain areas. So that's what happens up here in the brain. One interesting part is your brain and your spinal cord are connected. So the brain in your skull and the spinal cord that runs all the way down your back to your to right above your butt crack, right? Like along your spine. So from your top of your skull to the bottom of your spine, it's one continuous, you can think of it, bundle of nerves. So this is what's responsible for you being you, for all the reactions that you're having, is that all of these kind of wires that are connected and what processes it. Everything else on the outside we call the peripheral. Peripheral means on the outside nervous system. So today we're going to kind of look a little bit about the central nervous system, and then we'll talk a little bit about the peripheral as well. All this information we're going to be going over in more detail later on. So today it's just going to be kind of an overview of what are all the different parts. So most important for the central nervous system is your brain. So your brain is pretty much the control center of your body. It collects information from the rest of your body, it processes it, and then it gets things to do actions. So it's important that your brain not only talk to the rest of your body, but it talks to each other. Your brain is just a bunch of neurons that are all connected to one another that takes signals from everywhere and tries to do something with it. Your brain takes about 20% of your total body's energy. So 20% of everything that you eat goes to powering your brain. So it's really hungry organ. If you are cut off, so if you aren't, if you don't get enough oxygen to your brain, so say you pass out, right, you could get brain damage within a couple minutes because your brain constantly needs to produce energy in order to stay alive and in order for it to work. We're going to look at the different lobes in sec for the brain, but there are different parts of your brain that are responsible for doing different things. And that brain is connected to what we have here, our spinal cord. So spinal cord carries info to the rest of your body, and it also brings it back to your brain. So we're going to look at a couple cool different videos that show how the brain's set up and with your spinal cord. Cool. And then we'll talk about the reflexes. What is it? Okay, cool. This is our last slide before we start getting into kind of the video examples. So when we talk about your central nervous system, for your brain, what is the main thing that's protecting your brain right now? So what protects our brain from damage? Yeah, we have our skull, right? So we have hard bone that connects, that protects your brain from damage. So underneath your skull, right, if you were to cut away your skull, you have a couple different layers that actually help protect your brain as well. So think about this, right? If you have a helmet, right? If you had a helmet that was made just out of like a piece of steel, right? A really hard piece of metal, that would protect your brain from getting caved in, right? But when we think about helmets, right? Besides the hard outside, what's underneath the helmet when you put on a helmet? Because you have the hard outer layer, but what's underneath the helmet? You get padding, you have cushioning, right? Because the problem is if I had a hard substance pressed against a soft substance, right? If I hit that hard substance is just going to transfer all that energy into whatever's under it. So for a helmet to work, you need to have a cushion. And that's what these layers underneath are. These are our cushions. So these are what we call the meninges. They're layers of tissue around the brain that forms that kind of padding. When you guys graduate, or you should be getting it soon, typically before you go off to college, they make you get a shot for what we call meningitis. And that's when you have like a really serious condition where this layer around your brain becomes swollen, it becomes infected, and it starts like putting pressure on your brain. And you can get really, really sick because it's like an infection in the layers around your brain. So there are kind of two ways that your brain protects itself. Number one is you have, well, three. You have your hard skull. You have these layers of kind of padding, but also your brain is floating in like a layer of water. So in your skull, you have like layers of padding, and under that you have this set of water, which your brain kind of floats in. And this is called our cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. So we're going to look at, oh yeah, so your CSF, your spinal fluid, you could actually take some of it out, and we're going to look at that process called a spinal tap. But if you want to test what's going on in someone's brain, you could actually take some of this fluid that's in your brain, and you can take it from their spine because it's all one big track. You can actually extract some of this fluid. We'll see what it looks like in a second through that process called spinal tap. All right, so let's actually look at a brain. I don't know why they say it's inappropriate. It's a dissection. I don't know. It's odd. All right. So for this one, I'm going to kind of mute just because this is a little bit beyond what we're doing before. So I'm going to just kind of explain what's going on before this. All right. So this is a brain. So the human brain is extremely soft. So my sister, who's actually done brain surgery, she is a plastic surgeon. So she's done like reconstructive surgery. She says that working on a brain is like, it's like wet tissue paper. It's really, really soft. But what we're going to see here is she's able to actually touch it and kind of mess around with it because these brains are preserved. So they're put in a liquid that keeps them from falling apart, keeps them from rotting, right? So the color changes a little bit. Your brain's kind of more of a gray color versus this pinkish, well, it's kind of like a grayish pink color versus this like beige. So let's look at the brain itself. So you can see this is a human brain. You have a couple different layers, and we'll go into more detail with that. Today, we're going to kind of focus on the different parts of the brain. So this here is the covering. This is the outer layer of the meninges. And then your brain itself is this kind of soft, squishy, wrinkly organ. So you have this big layer on the outside. And then underneath, you have these smaller layers. So this is more of the cushioning that happens. So all of this membrane that's kind of in the way, this is what the actual brain is, and this is kind of what's covering it. And we can see it here where this is like the, this is part of what we call the meninges. So this outer layer is actually really thick, and we'll see in a second when she picks it up. And we're going to watch this a couple more times too. It's pretty long, but for today, I just want you to see how she's pulling on this. Look at how she's tugging on this, right? This is like kind of like, you ever imagine like a swim cap or like this really tough leathery outside? This is what surrounds your brain to help protect it. And it also has these kind of dividers to kind of help keep everything in place. So those are kind of the different parts that protect your brain, our meninges and different pieces. We're going to look at, for the last part today, this process, which we call a spinal tap. And they have like this ridiculous music and font. So this is kind of a medical training, but I like narrating over this. So I'll show you guys kind of what's going on with this. So this is what we call a spinal tap. The goal of the spinal tap is to collect some of that cerebrospinal fluid. So we're taking a sample of the fluid that is around this person's brain. So we can't take a needle and jam it through somebody's skull, right? Because the skull is way too hard, and we're going to risk poking the brain itself. So what we do instead is we actually, if you think about your spine, right? If you run your finger around your back, you can feel those different bones in your spine. They take a needle and they put it in between those bones. So one thing that's, and if you're squeamish around needles, I warn you, this is a little bit intense. So I don't want to have any nightmare fuel going forward, but if needles aren't your jam, this might be a little bit intense. So one of the things that you really need to be careful. So if we look at where they're injecting, this person felt this spot. They're trying to go between the two bones in the spine. And you want to be really careful because you don't want to damage those nerves. If you hit one of the nerves, you can cause someone to become paralyzed. So this is kind of a scary procedure because if you mess up, you can cause someone like paralysis. So if we look at the probe that they put in, we have a really long needle that goes in, and they're putting it into the space. And a lot of this is for feel, right? You can kind of feel when you're pushing against bone versus when you're pushing against this. So the point of this, the reason why I'm showing you guys kind of this idea here is I want you to look at the fluid that comes out, right? Oh, look at that long needle. Oh, man. Okay. So this, what's dripping out right here is, this is the cerebral spinal fluid. This is the water that's surrounding your brain. So you can get some of this fluid that surrounds your brain by taking it out of your spinal cord. And the reason you would do this is to kind of test to see if there were any bacteria or if you had any diseases that affected your brain. That's one way to do it, is just to look at the fluid that's coming around your brain. And I won't show you the needle going back in because that's much, but yeah, so this kind of goes with one of the questions that we were looking at moving forward about what is a spinal tap. All right, and then how much do we have left? Okay, cool. So this last one, I'm just going to kind of go over this briefly, and then we'll get to the questions for today. So we're going to focus on the peripheral nervous system a lot before we go into the brain. So really, your peripheral nervous system is responsible for two things. It's responsible for reflexes. So if you get, say, like you get hit on the knee, right, and you kick your foot up, babies have a really cool one. It's called the Babinski reflex. So if you take a baby and you lightly touch the bottom of their feet, their toes curl in. So this is kind of a reflex that happens without your brain thinking about it. These are what we call autonomic ones, which are parts of like reflexes and other stuff. They're involuntary movements. So your peripheral nervous system could be involved in like kind of two different things. Voluntary movements, so you moving around, and involuntary stuff. So like your heart beating, your digestive tract, the muscles in your digestive tract squeezing food down. We're going to go more into these two types. So we have sympathetic and parasympathetic, but the main difference is fight or flight, right? When you see that, when someone slams on the brakes, you get that rush of adrenaline. That's your sympathetic, where your body has to react right away. Parasympathetic is more of your rest and digest. It's the stuff that happens behind the scenes. So it's you processing that big meal that you ate for dinner as you're falling asleep, right? Cool. So that's it for our notes for today. Our focus over the next 15 minutes is I want you guys to go through and answer these three questions. So these three questions you should find through your lecture material. So these kind of are three big ideas moving forward. For us today, we have about 15 minutes to go to work on these. We'll save the last 5 minutes or so and see if you have any questions that you want to go over for 1, 2, or 3, or if you have trouble finding this info.